The evening crept in slow, like a prayer lost on the wind. Dust rolled across the prairie in fading sunlight, and the land, dry, brittle, unforgiving, whispered the truth of a place where people didn't so much live as survive. Tobias Hartwell, a man who'd lived alone for 12 years, stood in the open yard of his ranch. From atop the distant ridge, he'd spotted it. Red stains along the dirt, like withered flowers crushed under boots. He had seen death up close more times than he could count. And he knew that wasn't deer's blood. The trail led behind the barn, straight to the old stone well that had saved him more than once. And there, hunched against its base, was a man. Young, wiry, built like someone used to running hard through rough country. A native warrior. His left hand clutched his side, where blood still seeped from a deep, angry wound. His right hand reached upward, trembling, toward the wooden bucket swaying just out of reach above his head. Only a few feet, but with the kind of thirst that claws the throat and the kind of pain that hollows a man out, it might as well have been the moon. His eyes, dark, alert, and full of agony, locked with Tobias's. And in them Tobias saw not threat, not hatred, just a man dying of thirst and fear. In 1847, finding a native man on your land wasn't just trouble, it was the kind of trouble that got you killed. Every neighbor Tobias had would say the same thing. Shoot him, bury him, and don't tell a soul. Tobias raised his rifle. His finger brushed the trigger, a motion so practiced it felt like instinct. But he didn't pull it. Something in those eyes stopped him. Not just pain. Something else. Memory. The drought of 44. 3 days without water. He'd wandered his own land like a ghost, tongue swollen, vision blurred, praying for rain that never came. He knew what it meant to feel your body shutting down from thirst. And if someone, anyone, had offered him a cup of water then, he would have dropped to his knees in gratitude, even if it were his worst enemy. The man before him tried to speak, his lips cracked and bleeding. Only one word escaped, hoarse as a dying breeze. Water. Tobias lowered the rifle, not out of kindness, not out of nobility, but because, in that moment, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a human being. He reached for the rope, turned the crank, and let the bucket sink into the deep, cool silence of the well. The splash of water echoed up like a hymn. When the bucket rose, full and dripping, he brought it to the man's mouth. The warrior drank with desperate gulps, like a man crawling back from the edge of the grave. 1 bucket, then 2, then 3. Until at last, his hands stopped shaking, and his gaze steadied, no longer just pained, but now grateful. And in that moment, Tobias knew, this wasn't just an act of mercy. This was the turning point of everything. As the man drank, Tobias's gaze moved to the wound. It wasn't an animal bite, not an accident. It was a bullet wound, fresh, still bleeding. Powder burns around the edges told him what he feared. The shot had been fired at close range, which meant whoever did it might still be out there, might be following this blood trail, might be riding straight for Tobias's ranch, with loaded guns and questions he couldn't answer. The warrior saw the fear in Tobias's face. With effort, he pointed toward the horizon, then dragged his hand across his own throat. The message was clear. Danger. Coming fast. Tobias's heart pounded. He could drag the man away, hide him, lie about it all, or abandon him here and pretend none of this ever happened. But the warrior couldn't move. He'd die if Tobias tried to relocate him. That's when Tobias heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming fast. He knew that sound, had trusted it with his life for over a decade. It was never good when you heard more than one horse at full gallop. The warrior heard it too. His eyes went wide with a fear that looked too real to fake. He tried to press himself lower, as if becoming smaller could make him disappear. Blood soaked through his shirt again. Tobias grabbed the empty bucket and tossed water over the blood trail, scrubbing as fast as he could. But there wasn't enough time. They were almost here. He looked down at the wounded man, this stranger who had dropped into his quiet world and turned it inside out in the span of a single hour. A man whose presence might now get them both killed. But Tobias saw something in his eyes again. Not panic. Not desperation. Something softer. Gratitude. The hoofbeats thundered now. 5 horses. Maybe 6. Galloping fast. Too fast to be friendly. Tobias made his decision in a breath. He couldn't carry the man. But he could try to hide him. The old root cellar behind the barn. Maybe they could make it. He reached down to help. But the warrior grabbed his wrist, strong, steady, and shook his head. And then he smiled. Not the smile of a man being saved. The smile of someone who already knew exactly who was coming. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Not an echo, but something real, like a dust storm thundering straight toward them. Tobias stood in front of the well, blood still on his hands, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the red haze concealed riders that didn't belong. He had no good choices left. The stranger, the wounded native man behind him, stirred faintly. His hand clutched Tobias's wrist, as if delivering one final warning. Tobias turned, and in those dark eyes he didn't see fear. He saw foresight. The wind carried the scent of iron, blood, and gunpowder. Then they appeared. 6 riders came over the hill like a dark tide. The one in front Tobias recognized instantly. Marshal Dixon Webb, a lawman with a reputation carved from gunfire and silence. The kind of man who asked questions after the shooting stopped, if at all. Webb pulled his horse to a halt, just 10 feet away. His pale blue eyes were sharp, calculating. One hand rested casually on his pistol. The other 5 men fanned out behind him like a net. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said lazily. Like this was just another dust-blown conversation. "We're tracking a wounded Indian. Blood trail leads right here." Tobias felt sweat bead on his temple despite the cool air. "Ain't seen anyone. Been working the south fence all day," he replied, trying to keep his voice even. Webb's eyes drifted slowly across the ranch. They missed nothing. Then they landed, right at Tobias's feet. A dark stain, still wet. "That so?" Webb dismounted slowly, like a predator playing with its food. "Because that looks like fresh blood to me. And unless you've been butchering cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been bleeding here." Tobias didn't look back, but he knew the man behind him was holding his breath. One sound, one wrong twitch, and they'd both be corpses before sunset. Webb took a few more steps. His fingers tapped the grip of his revolver. "You know what the penalty is for harboring a fugitive Injun? Same as treason. Rope around the neck until dead." Tobias clenched his jaw. Not from fear of Webb, but because he realized there was no turning back. He'd given the man water, seen the gratitude in his eyes, and there was no way to erase that kind of truth. The air between them was stretched tight, one heartbeat away from snapping. And then the impossible happened. The wounded native spoke. Not in English, but in his native Apache tongue. The words flowed like river stones. Deep, rounded, deliberate. And Marshal Webb stopped mid-step, his face drained of color. "Dear God," he whispered. "It's you, it's you." Behind him, the deputies scrambled off their horses. No longer tense, now uncertain. Afraid even. Not the fear of an enemy. The fear of realizing they might have just made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. Webb turned to Tobias, his voice trembling. "Do you have any idea who you've just helped?" Tobias said nothing. He just looked at the man before him, and the one dying behind him, and felt the quiet, shaking breath of a storm just beginning to break. Tobias stood still, not out of fear but sheer disbelief. The native man he'd helped, the man who drank from his well with trembling hands, had just made Marshal Webb pale like a ghost. His very name had silenced 6 armed men. "You really don't know who you helped, do you?" Webb repeated, eyes darting. Tobias turned slowly to the man resting against the well. He wasn't just a wounded stranger anymore. There was something else in his bearing now, something commanding, like a man used to being listened to. That man locked eyes with Webb and spoke, his voice clear, controlled, and spoken in perfect English. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you came here ready to kill." Webb swallowed hard. His voice cracked like dry wood. "This is Ayana, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache." He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring. Tobias felt the world tilt under his boots. That treaty had stopped 3 bloody years of violence. It had saved lives, settlers and natives alike. And he had just offered water to the man who made it possible. But if Ayanna was a man of peace, why are they hunting you? Tobias asked, not even sure he wanted the answer. Ayanna's eyes didn't blink. His voice stayed calm. 3 days ago, I met with Colonel Morrison to expand the treaty to include the southern tribes. But before we could speak, he was shot in the back. Webb jumped in quickly. By your people. Witnesses saw war paint. Apache feathers. No! Ayanna interrupted sharply. Those were imposters. They knew a few Apache phrases. Enough to fool the witnesses. They wore furs, used our weapons, but they weren't ours. It was staged. The words hit like thunder. Tobias looked at Webb, and for the first time he saw uncertainty in the lawman's eyes. Who staged it? Webb asked, though his tone betrayed that he already feared the answer. The ones selling rifles to the rebel bands, Ayanna said. The men making fortunes off war. The ones terrified that peace would make them irrelevant. Webb took a step back. His hand hovered near his pistol, not for defense, but as instinct. You're accusing officials. You're accusing me, Ayanna. Webb hissed. That's the kind of talk that gets a man hanged. Ayanna didn't flinch. He reached into a blood-stained pouch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is why they want me dead. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb froze, staring at the letter like it might explode. What's in it? Names, dates, prices, everything, including the name of someone in the marshal's office. Someone taking bribes to look the other way. The silence was thick. Tobias watched Webb's face drain of color. The deputies behind him were starting to glance at each other. Something was shifting and fast. You're lying, Webb said weakly. Am I? Ayanna lifted the letter. Morrison handed this to me himself. Told me to get it to Fort Richardson if anything happened. He called it his insurance. Webb took a step forward, voice tightening. Give it to me. No, Ayanna replied. But I'll make you a deal. Let me live until tomorrow. Let me reach the Apache Council. And I'll make sure your name stays out of what comes next. The deal hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Then, something unexpected broke the tension. Deputy Bradley, the youngest of the lawmen, stepped forward. Hands empty. Hat off. Marshal, I've been thinking about that rifle shipment that disappeared 3 months ago. They said the Apache stole it. But 2 weeks later, I saw those same guns in the hands of settlers moving south. The words landed like a spark in dry grass. Tobias turned. In Bradley's eyes was something dangerous, truth wrapped in fear. And in that moment, the unraveling began. The air hung thick, like the stillness before a storm. After Bradley spoke, no one said a word. But their eyes said everything. It was time to choose. Marshal Webb scanned their faces. These were men who used to follow his orders without question. But now they looked at him like a stranger. Doubts they once buried were now rising, sharp and undeniable. You're all fools, Webb growled, his hand tightening on his holster. You'd believe a bleeding savage over your own marshal? A man selling peace for less than a sack of gunpowder. No one answered, until Bradley stepped forward, eyes clear, voice unwavering. I made one mistake by staying silent. I won't make another. Ayanna, leaning against the well, slowly pushed himself upright. Blood soaked his shirt, but his voice was as steady as ever. The truth doesn't need armor. It only needs to be spoken. Webb drew his gun. Everything happened in a single heartbeat. The barrel swung toward Ayanna. But before the trigger could fall, a new voice cracked the silence. Put it down, Marshal. Bradley, his pistol raised, calm, defiant, standing between the law and justice. For more deputies followed. No orders, just decisions. Tobias watched in stunned silence. The line had been drawn, not with bullets but with conviction. Webb let out a dry, bitter laugh. You think his word means more than mine? He's not even a citizen. Not even human to some of you. No one flinched. But in their stillness, Webb saw the truth. They no longer feared him. Ayana's voice came soft, but it cut through the dusk like a blade. You never cared for our voices, until we spoke truths you couldn't bury. Webb screamed and turned his gun, this time toward Tobias. But Tobias didn't back away. I gave a thirsty man water, he said. And you opened the gates of hell, Webb shouted. The gun fired. Ayana moved. No cry, no hesitation, just instinct. He stepped between Tobias and the bullet. It caught his shoulder, blood blossoming like red ink. Before Webb could fire again, Tobias tackled him. They hit the ground hard. Dust clouded everything. And when it cleared, Webb was pinned. His gun gone. His reputation shattered. Deputies moved in, tying Webb and Hawkins with leather cords. There was no resistance. Only silence. Then Ayana stood. Barely. Bleeding, yes, but alive. His eyes found Tobias's. And then, he sang. Not a war cry. A song of kinship. Low. Melancholic. A melody like wind slipping between canyon walls. Ancient. Sacred. No one understood the words. But they all understood the meaning. And far off, carried on the wind, came the sound of hoofbeats. Not 10. Not 20. But an entire nation answering the call. Not to fight, but to witness justice. Ayana's song faded like a prayer carried off by the wind. And then silence. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats. Not just a few. Many. Steady. Close. Webb heard them too. His face turned pale. How many? He whispered. Ayana smiled through his pain. Enough. And then they came. Over the ridge, moving like a tide of shadows in golden light, 50 Apache horsemen rode in formation. No shouting. No raised weapons. Just presence, powerful and unmistakable. At the front rode an elder with braided silver hair tied with eagle feathers. He sat his black horse tall and proud. Chief Takakota. Even from a distance, Tobias felt the strength in his stillness. He didn't need to speak. He simply was. Webb's hand tightened on his holster. But before he could act, another voice cut through the tension. The warrant for Ayana has been suspended. I have the governor's order here. Everyone turned. Deputy Bradley held up an official-looking document. His voice was calm, firm. There's one just like it in your dispatch pouch, Marshal. You just didn't read it. Webb didn't respond. He looked around. The Apache riders were forming a wide circle. Not threatening, but undeniably present. Chief Takakota dismounted. Each step he took seemed to still the air around him. He walked straight to the well, where Ayana rested. Ayana looked up. They locked eyes. Then, father and son embraced, and the whole world seemed to exhale. Tobias stood a few feet away, witnessing something sacred, something not his. Yet somehow he had earned a place beside it. The chief spoke softly to Ayana. Ayana replied in a mix of Apache and English. Words like truth, betrayal, and names floated to Tobias's ears. Then Chief Takakota turned to Webb, his voice steady, his gaze sharp as flint. Marshal Webb, he said. My son tells me you came here to kill him. Webb stood rigid. I came to arrest a fugitive who uncovered the truth about you and your partners. Men who sold peace for profit and turned neighbors into enemies. A warrior approached with a leather satchel. Inside were letters, documents, ledgers, undeniable proof. Weapons deals. Secret payments. Orders buried and rewritten. Colonel Morrison documented everything, the chief said. He knew you would betray him. Webb lunged for his gun. But Tobias tackled him. The two men crashed into the dust. The pistol flew clear. When the dirt settled, Webb lay pinned, defeated. The deputies bound Webb and Hawkins with leather ties. No resistance, no defense. Then the chief approached Tobias. Without a word, he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders. His eyes held deep meaning. Ayana stepped forward, voice thick with emotion. He says you are now our brother. What you did today, showing mercy to a stranger, standing for truth, risking your life not for glory but for simple decency. Those are the actions of a true warrior. Tobias's chest tightened. Something inside him cracked open. All his life he'd been taught to fear these people. But now, in this circle, he saw dignity he'd never known. One by one, the warriors came forward. Each touched Tobias's arm. Not a handshake, a recognition. Then the gift. The chief handed him a war lance, decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork, worn smooth by generations of hands. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief said, "and his before him. It has never been held by anyone outside our people, until now." Iona clasped Tobias's hand one last time before mounting his horse. "You didn't just save me," he said. "You saved peace." And it all began with one bucket of water. Tobias smiled, eyes damp. "I only did what anyone should, when they see someone suffering." Then they rode away. The sun dipped behind the hills. The prairie was still. Tobias stood alone. No longer just a rancher by a well, but a man who had been chosen.